Derek Overstreet, founder of the New Millennium Group. We're a financial planning firm. We have advisors standing by right now to take your call. 888-999-6370. The reason you're going to want to call is we're going to help you retire 3 to 5 years before you thought possible. The way we do this is by putting together a step-by-step plan. So if you're one of those people listening and you'd like a plan in writing, give us a call at 888-999-6370. That's 888-999-6370, or go to utahsfinancialplanner.com.
Only one type of burger. For every pallet. Fries are extra. Large in size. We've got the shakes. Going over the brim.
Hey, this is Chris from JCW's. Put a positive, delicious spin on your day at any one of our 5 locations. In Lehigh, American Fork, Provo, South Jordan, or Harriman. JCW's, quality and a lot of it.
All right, here's a man I bet enjoys a great steak. Hey, if you're lining up at a steak place, you going ribeye, you going sirloin, you going porterhouse, what are you going with, Bartle?
Man, what a great way to start this conversation,
I know, right?
Scotty. It's, the more we can talk about beef, I'm all about it. And I'm a ribeye guy. When I go out, I enjoy a good ribeye.
Nice. I am very much a ribeye guy. I know it's a little cliche, but I'm not necessarily a prime rib guy. I mean, I love prime rib. Don't get me wrong, but if I have to choose between prime rib or ribeye, it's going to be ribeye every day of the week.
Yeah, and over the last couple of years, I've enjoyed making myself, a little homemade, prime rib and that sort of thing, and that's where I prioritize, getting a prime rib. I'm going to make the prime rib myself.
Nice.
But going out, it's all about the ribeye.
I think you're about the same way I am with ribs. Like, I will not go to a barbecue joint and order ribs because I know that the ribs I make at home are better. So why would I spend money on something that I can do better at home? So it sounds like that's how you got prime rib dialed in.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the care, it's the nurturing of the meat, it's just all of those factors that just make it, special, make it tough to purchase those when you're going out. It's just, it's just not the same.
I'm assuming you're a medium rare guy.
Big time. Yep.
Okay.
Big time medium rare. I'll go medium, but big time medium rare.
All right. Hey, by the way, I need to have you out. So I do these barbecue competitions, and there's also steak competitions. And so it's actually cooking ribeyes. And so I ought to have you come out to one of these comps with me and check out the place, because these dudes, they know what they're doing. They don't mess around with those ribeyes. All right.
Well, I'm disappointed you haven't gotten me out already, man.
I know. All right. Well, enough of me stalling. We got to talk about what's going on up at the Hill. Spring ball going on right now. If somebody is going to watch this Utah team at Rice-Eccles Stadium for the first game of the year and compare it to what they saw last year from an offensive standpoint, are there going to be a lot of significant differences?
Ooh, what a good question, right? Obviously there are going to be differences in terms of personnel and the names you need to know. But the most important thing for Utah is that they've got their quarterback, back. They've got their running back back. The guys that are going to be, big-time contributors in terms of their volume and how often they're touching the ball, those guys are back. And I think that's a big deal. Even going to that wide receiver room, you lose Ryan Davies, you lose Dallin Bentley, but you're bringing back a couple receivers that showed some flashes, towards the end of the season, Larry Simmons and Creed Whittemore. You've added 2 dynamic receivers in Braden Pagan and Kyrie Scholes, and you're very familiar with Pagan and what he's all about. And so, I do think it's going to look fairly similar, in terms of the structure and formations and that. But I do think there's going to be a little bit of a change, a little tweaking in terms of, the types of personnel we see. And, we'll probably see a little bit more wide receiver heavy type of an offense. And I think, through the first couple practices that we've been able to watch, so far the wide receivers, each time we've been up there, they've made plays. And there's depth here. I hate getting into is this the best wide receiver room Utah's ever had type of conversation, because we don't know, right? We don't know until these guys get on the field in the season and produce. But in terms of just the depth and quality, at spots 5, 6, and 7, I think it's really encouraging for Utah. So, I think there's going to be a lot of similarities to what we saw last year in terms of the plays and the actions and that type of stuff. But there are going to be some tweaks and a little some differences, and probably most obvious will be the greater emphasis on that wide receiver position.
So, getting in the weeds a little bit here, I've been around Kevin McGivern a couple times, and one thing he's always really good about is adapting. I think he adapts better than anybody in college football in terms of what he's got available to him. His offensive line at Utah State last year was not great, and that's putting it mildly. But what he was able to accomplish with Bryson Barnes and that offense in scheming around a not a particularly good offensive line, I thought was really incredible. And Bryson, frankly, if Utah State was able to win a couple more games, should have been Mountain West Conference Player of the Year based on what he was able to do. So knowing that and knowing his ability to adjust and having Devin Dampier back for another year, is he essentially using the same kind of language and schematic, at least the schematic language that they're using? Is it pretty much the same as last year?
Yeah, that was the big selling point. When Kevin McGivern was announced as the offensive coordinator hire for Morgan Scalley, that was the big point of emphasis to us and what was communicated as to why McGivern, obviously his track record and what he's been able to do throughout the course of his career. You go to his time, up in Logan, you go back to his time at San Jose State, and you look at the offenses that he's had and some of the production. He's had some years where it's been heavy pass, and they've been one of the top passing offenses in the country. He's had, heavy rushing attacks, and that speaks to his ability to adapt to what they've got on the roster, the strengths of the roster. And so coming here, this is going to be a really fascinating process. You mentioned the offensive line at Utah State, and I've had the opportunity to talk with Bryson Barnes since McGivern was hired at Utah, and he kind of talked about the need to involve him quite a bit in the run game to take advantage of the opportunities there with the offensive line in front of him. And I think there are going to be some things there with Dev and with Bird Ficklin where they're going to look to get that QB run and have that a focal point of the offense with this offensive line that has to replace 5 starters. And so that's going to be a process, but I do think there are a lot of pieces here where, he can supplement some different things. There's still enough here where there's going to be balance, right? I just talked a lot about the wide receiver position and that becoming a greater point of emphasis. But bringing back Wayshawn Parker, bringing back Daniel Bray, who flashed, in exciting situations and made some big-time plays, getting those guys back for another year, adding, a player like Steve Chavez Soto, who's, very similar to what they had in Kerry Rogers, but maybe offers a little bit more juice, a little bit more, big play potential. And then, too, they've brought in another freshman in LaMarcus Bell. So there's still enough here where, he can find balance between the passing and run games. And that's going to be the process for him. We had the opportunity to hear from McGivern on Wednesday, and he talked about the need to evaluate, obviously, the roster and kind of the production Utah had offensively last year, because if you don't find ways to kind of marry what you bring with what's already here, you're not doing your job. And I think that is something that, as you alluded to, McGivern has done a really good job of adapting to his personnel. And so I think, there is going to be a step back in terms of the offensive line, going from 2 first-round guys on the edges and 3 veterans on the interior to now a completely new offensive line. But I still think there's enough there in that offensive line unit where he can feel comfortable and confident in utilizing the run game and feeling like there's going to be enough there to provide that sort of balance to be complementary to all phases of the game.
You know, obviously, Jordan Gross's resume as a player, not only in college but certainly in the NFL, is unmatched, but still a little bit raw as a coach coming from the high school ranks. The name that we've mentioned a lot, and as soon as that name got thrown out, I think you were the first one to tell me about it, that he was going to help out Jordan Gross, is Alex Gerke. And his resume as a coach is phenomenal, and having that expertise as a little bit of a safety blanket, I don't think can be really overstated in how important he can be to help kind of groom not only that offensive line, but Jordan Gross as a coach as well.
Do you love rom-coms? Do you wish you could talk about Christmas movies year-round? Then we have the perfect podcast for you, Hallmarkies Podcast. Throughout the year, we cover all things romance, holiday, and Hallmark, including recaps of every Hallmark show, like When Calls the Heart and The Way Home. You can also get loads of bonus content covering shows like Bridgerton, Sweet Magnolias, and just like that. We are an all-female group of friends who are passionate for these shows and movies and give our honest opinions as well as gush over what we love so much. But that's not all. Every Monday, there are interviews with all your favorite actors, writers, directors, and more. Check out Hallmarkies Podcast on all your podcast providers and on YouTube. That's Hallmarkies Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
No, absolutely. I think that is one of the kind of dark horse hires, right, that Scalley has made with his staff. Obviously, Gross is going to grab the headlines because, you know, of his playing experience and the success he had in the NFL, and obviously him coming in with the highly touted five-star freshman offensive lineman Kelvin Obot. You understand that there's a lot of excitement around Gross, and he talked about it, his decision to come to Utah and to join Morgan Scalley, be one of the guys, you know, on his initial staff and what that means to him. But Alex Gerke is somebody that, you know, he coached Jordan Gross at Utah, and he's been coaching offensive line for a really long time. He's coming from Weber State, you know, most recently, and he's having that, you know, to pair with Gross and to kind of be a mentor of sorts is going to, I think, really help Gross kind of acclimate to some of the things that we don't get to see all the time, right? The in-house stuff, the office work, the scouting, the, you know, film evaluation, and those types of things that coaches have to do. I think that's where Gerke is really going to help Gross make the adjustment to this level, right, of being a coach. And what's interesting too is, you know, we were up there Saturday getting to watch practice, and they were able to split up the offensive line into two groups where, you know, Gross took the top 6 or 7 guys, and Gerke was able to work with the rest of the group. And so to have that where you have this NFL legend guy that has the playmaking, the credentials, not the playmate, but the credentials there as a player, and then Gerke, who's just has a history, a strong resume as an offensive line coach, to be able to kind of help with the development of guys. It's given Utah 2 offensive line coaches that have, you know, really encouraging resumes or qualities that Scalley believes in. And I think that's going to be a big benefit to this offensive line group, because as I mentioned earlier, right, you're replacing 5 guys, and there are some guys that return with some experience, some snaps under their belt, but there's a lot to figure out there. And so to have these 2 there to navigate it all, I think is going to really benefit Utah in that offensive line room.
Steve Bartle, he is our Ute insider, KSLSports.com, joining us right here on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone. Steve, when you look on the defensive side of the ball, and look, Morgan's been running that defense for a long, long time. You do lose some key players, both in the transfer portal and just out of eligibility. Do you anticipate the defense, much like the offensive line, just based on the numbers, taking a bit of a step back, or do you think they can still continue a high level of play right out of the gate?
You know, there's always going to be that standard for Utah on the defensive side of the ball under Morgan Scalley. You know, it's been that way with Kyle the last 2 decades, and that's only going to continue with Scalley leading the way. Now Swan taking over those defensive coordinator duties, and, you know, it'll be interesting. Obviously, Utah has lost a lot, you know, whether through graduation or, players moving on to the transfer portal. There's a lot to replace. But, I think there's going to be areas of that defensive unit that actually improve despite what they lost. And first and foremost, outside of that defensive end spot with John Henry Daly and what he was able to do this past season, I think there's reason to be really optimistic about that defensive tackle group, which really struggled over the final couple weeks of the season with, Kansas State and Kansas in particular, and then Nebraska in the bowl game. That defensive tackle group just wasn't able to hold up, against the run. And I think Utah's added some pieces there. They've got some young guys that are developing. And I think that's a group that will be surprisingly better than what we saw last season, despite what they had and, a couple of veterans in that group. And there's context to that, right? There were Dallas Vakalahi dealing with injuries, Aliki Vomahi dealing with injuries, Jonalea Ea being, a 285-pound defensive tackle being tasked with holding up the interior. It's a lot to ask. And I think Utah's going to have better depth there. And that when Utah has strong play, at that D tackle spot, it just does so much for the rest of the defense. And that linebacker group, there's a couple guys there that I think could potentially surprise us. Cyrus Tolu, going into year two, I think he's somebody that when talking to folks in and around the program, his name comes up quite a bit, and he's making plays in practice. And I think he's going to be a guy that, breaks through and starts to see some opportunities. And that's going to be what you're looking for. You're looking for guys to step up. And so you're starting to see that, at the defensive tackle spot with a guy like Carson Kafusi. You're starting to see that at linebacker with Cyrus Tolu. The secondary is going to be really fascinating because you've got Jackson Denny, who was kind of a do-it-all on both sides of the ball type of athlete. You've got two other guys coming back, and Rabbit Evans and Nate Ritchie. And even though we didn't get to see Rabbit Evans, I remember going back to last year's spring camp, Rabbit was the buzzword, just in terms of what he was doing on the field. He was a dynamic playmaker all through spring camp last year. Suffered the season-ending injury, and so we didn't get to see it. But I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic there. And then with the shift that Utah has made, or the prioritization in that quarterback room of adding size, adding length, seeing that up close on Saturday with, I think they've got 6 or 7 corners now that are 6'2 plus, and just what that does for their coverage potential and what they can do in man coverage. It's going to be exciting and potentially kind of overcome what they lost in that secondary as well. So it's going to require, the coaches to get some development out of guys and to kind of coach them up and to have them ready to go. But there's pieces in place here for Utah to have another pretty stingy defense next season.
So before we let you go, if you would have taken me back to December when the transfer portal opened, regardless if Kyle Whittingham was the coach or Morgan Scalley, I would never in a million years bet that you would have had the return of both Devin Dampier and Bert Ficklin on this roster. So now that they are both back, do you anticipate the usage of those two being somewhat similar to last year, or does that get a little wrinkle to it as well?
Well, Scotty, you're kind of an appropriate guy to ask that question, because I'm going to throw something right back at you. With Kevin McGivern, you kind of saw something, a little two QB usage there up in Logan. I'm blanking on the other quarterback's name that they utilized in kind of a unique way, but he was a do-it-all athlete. Ran the ball, caught the ball. I would not be surprised to see Utah maybe explore some of those opportunities with Bert Ficklin, because, Bert is a dynamic athlete. He's somebody that, we saw what he could do with the ball in his hands, as a quarterback, right, in that option stuff. And so, if you're McGivern, given what you did last year with your two QBs up at Utah State, why not experiment and see what you can do with Dev and with Bird in that same sort of manner? So, I think there's potential for Bird's role to expand beyond just quarterback usage. But I think, McGivern is coming into this with the primary focus of developing these guys into complete quarterbacks. And so I think that's going to be the priority first and foremost, is developing Dev into a quarterback that can go through progressions, that can make reads and make quick decisions. And the same with Bird. There's a lot of belief in him, as the quarterback to take over when Dev's career comes to an end. And so that development is going to be key. But they've done enough. They did enough last season where I think it's absolutely worth McGivern and that offensive staff, exploring some different ways to get those guys on the field, either together or just in their own unique opportunities. I think that's absolutely something that McGivern will probably look at this offseason.
Anthony Garcia was the other quarterback, and he started at wide receiver, but they played him at quarterback. He had 6 completions on the season. 4 of them went for touchdowns. So and he had a couple of 2-point conversion throws in there too. So they had some fun with him. He also ran the ball a little bit, and I think that frankly, and no disrespect to Anthony Garcia, but Bird Ficklin is Anthony Garcia on steroids. So I think that the amount of fun that Kevin McGivern can have with that offense is going to be really, really interesting with those two, for sure. Well, Steve, always a pleasure, man. Thanks for joining us. Let's do it again soon, all right?
Sounds good, Scotty. Appreciate you, brother.
You got it. There he is, one of the best dudes out there, Steve Bartle, KSLSports.com, Utah insider. As spring ball continues on, next week we'll take a closer look at what's going on in BYU spring ball as well as Utah State spring ball, as football, frankly, cannot get here soon enough. 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
This is Mike Volo of Lexicon Valley.
And I'm Bob Garfield. Are you one of those people who sometimes uses words?
Do you communicate or acquire information with, language?
Hey, us too. So join us on Lexicon Valley to chew over the history, culture, and many mysteries of English, plus some wisecracks.
Find us on one of those apps where people listen to podcasts.